This is the Tom Bigby Tales, and I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi called Columbus along the Tom Bigby River, and sometimes I write about the rest of the state. This episode is titled Frances Ormond Jones Gaither. Frances Gaither was born in Summerville, Tennessee in May of 1889, and soon after she was born, her family moved to Corinth, Mississippi, where she would go to school before coming to Columbus and attending IINC, which is now MUW. She graduated from the Women's College in 1909 and would return home to Corinth to teach English for a few years. She would marry Rice Gaithers in 1912. He was a journalist and had been an editor with the Mobile Register and with the Memphis Commercial Appeal when they met in Columbus while each was there visiting friends. They dated for a few short months before taking the train to Corinth to marry there. In 1925, Rice and Frances would travel to Paris, London, and other points in France to explore and write. They would end up settling in New York City, where he was an editor, a copy editor for the New York Times. And they would live on the west side on West 24th Street. She wrote magazine articles and children's books and novels and short stories and was a book reviewer while he was a copy editor. She had several successful novels with North Mississippi settings. Her novel, Muscadine, was a Book of the Month selection. Her novels, Follow the Drinking Gourd, Fatal River, Life and Death of LaSalle, and Red Cock Crows were all successful in their own right. Gaither was not afraid to take on difficult topics in her books, including slavery and the infantilization of enslaved people. She also openly addressed the chivalrous myths predating the Civil War of the purity of white Southern women. Follow the Drinking Gourd was held in the 1940s to be the antithesis of Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. No crinolines, no white columns or mint juleps. Gaither's books instead dealt with the reality of slavery as an institution of evil interdependence of the master, the overseer, and the enslaved, and the economic and social intersections that were in existence to preserve and safeguard the purity of Southern womanhood. The book won honorable mention in Best Book by a Southern author at the Southern Women's National Democratic Organization's conference in 1941. She would eventually die while visiting her extended family in Florida in October of 1955. A collection of papers of Frances and her husband Rice are held in the Archives Department of the New York Public Library. But Gaither, while little known within the Mississippi or the W's, Mississippi University for Women's MFA writing program, in her time was considered radical, refreshing, and subversive in her novels because of her deromanticization of race and slavery in the American South. Her work presented a counter-narrative to Mitchell's opus, Gone with the Wind, that obliterated romanticized myths about slavery and the enslaved. Gaither's work dug deeply into the consequences of miscegenation. And her work also probably rivals the work of IINC student Eudora Welty of greater fame. So why is Gaither forgotten for all her contributions to Southern literature and pretty much as a W girl? She only gets a minor mention in the Athena collection and on the famous people who went to the W's page, and that's about it. Why she's not taught in any of the programs. She's definitely not presented in anything I've ever had in the W's MFA program. Perhaps I missed it. Gaither's work examined the intersection of the struggle of the immorality of slavery and the mystery of the unspoken connections between whites and blacks in Southern culture. Perhaps that's why she was ignored. She properly villainizes the institution of slavery, which was a no-no as a Southern author. The collision between what white men in Southern literary circles are comfortable with and actual facts, and are never willing to address the mythology of Southern womanhood, much less dismantle the still existing myth that the relationship between whites and slaves and the life of the enslaved was allegedly, quote, so good that no one, not even a slave, could want to change it, end quote. Gaither boldly challenged these white-held myths. She especially dismantled the Southern codes of honor and womanhood. She addresses each in stark terms and with little sentiment. Gaither's powerful writing, steeped in extensive research, makes her one of Mississippi's finest novelists. She's yet another spectacular W girl in need of some real research and real recognition. Thank you for coming on my tour of Tom Bigby Tales and Columbus. I hope that you will like, subscribe, and leave a review on any of the platforms on which you listen to this podcast. Until next time.